On the morning of March 14, 1817, a gray donkey named Bartholomew stopped dead at the stone bridge, crossing the Lagan tributary near Dromore, County Down. The animal, known throughout the parish for its docile temperament, planted its hooves and refused to move, braying with such violence that foam gathered at its mouth. Its owner, 8-year-old Siobhan McCafferty, pulled at the rope until her small hands bled, but Bartholomew would not cross. 3 hours later, when the child's father arrived with a switch, the donkey finally relented, but only to the water's edge. There, it stopped again and pawed at the earth, its eyes rolling white with terror. What Patrick McCafferty found when he looked into the clear, cold stream would haunt him until his dying day 53 years later. Wedged between two rocks, partially submerged in water no deeper than 3 feet, was the body of Thomas Brennan, the illegal Catholic schoolmaster who had vanished 6 days earlier. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple drowning. Before we uncover the truth about the Dromore Hedge school donkey and the murder that exposed a network of informants, religious persecution and cold-blooded execution masquerading as accident, make sure to subscribe to Fear Abbey and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest chapters. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's step back into the Ireland of 1817, where teaching children to read could get you killed. Ireland in 1817 existed under the iron fist of the penal laws, a series of restrictions designed to suppress Catholic life and culture. Though some of these laws had been relaxed by the early 19th century, the education of Catholic children remained effectively criminalized. Catholic schools were banned, Catholic teachers were outlawed. The entire apparatus of British colonial rule demanded that Irish children be raised in Protestant schools speaking English, loyal to the crown. But the Irish are nothing if not stubborn. Throughout the countryside, in ditches and fields, behind hedgerows and in abandoned cottages, illegal schools operated in secret. These hedge schools moved locations constantly, taught in the Irish language, and preserved not just literacy but an entire culture the British Empire sought to extinguish. The teachers, called masters, risked imprisonment, transportation to Australia or worse. Dromore, a market town in County Down, sat in the heart of Protestant Ulster, making Catholic resistance particularly dangerous. The local magistrate, Sir Edmund Ashford, had built his reputation on zealous enforcement of the remaining penal laws. His informant network penetrated every Catholic community within 20 miles. 3 hedge school masters had been arrested in the previous 2 years. 1 died in prison of fever, the other 2 transported to Van Diemen's Land for 7 years each. Thomas Brennan knew these risks intimately. At 34 years old, Brennan was a rarity among hedge school masters. Formally educated at an illegal seminary in the Wicklow Mountains before the building was raided and burned in 1808. He spoke Latin, Greek, English, and Irish. He taught mathematics that would shame many Protestant schoolmasters. His students, aged 6 to 16, met in a different location each week: abandoned barns, dense copses of trees, the ruins of old monasteries. By all accounts, Brennan was cautious to the point of paranoia. He never kept written records of his students' names. He never slept in the same place 2 nights running. He trusted almost no one. His landlady, Widow O'Hare, would later testify that Brennan jumped at shadows, checked the road before leaving her cottage, and kept a heavy walking stick by his bed despite never raising a hand to any soul in violence. He knew they were watching, she said. He knew, and it made him too careful for what happened to be an accident. In early March 1817, Dromore was gripped by an unusually bitter cold snap. Ice formed on the Lagan River for the first time in a decade. The roads turned to frozen ruts that could snap a horse's ankle. It was during this cold that Thomas Brennan began to notice the same man at the edge of every gathering. A stranger, claiming to be seeking work, but never quite looking anyone in the eye. Something wasn't right. Brennan could feel it in his bones, the way animals sense earthquakes before they strike. On March 2nd, 1817, Brennan was walking from Widow O'Hare's cottage to that week's teaching location, a shepherd's hut 3 miles east of town. At the crossroads where the Dromore Road met the path to Ballinderry, he encountered a man he'd seen twice before. The stranger wore Protestant clothes, good wool, factory-made buttons, but spoke with an accent that wandered between Ulster and Dublin. "Cold morning for a walk, friend," the stranger said, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Brennan nodded but didn't stop. His instincts screamed danger. "Heading toward Ballinderry, are you?" the stranger called after him. "My cousin farms that way. Perhaps you know him, Michael Donnelly." The name meant nothing to Brennan, but the question meant everything. The stranger was fishing, trying to establish where Brennan was going, who he might know. This was how informants worked. Casual questions that seemed innocent but mapped your movements, your associations, your vulnerabilities. Brennan took a different path that day. His 12 students waited in vain at the shepherd's hut, while their master circled through frozen fields, watching his back trail for 3 hours before finally approaching. When he arrived, shaking with cold, he made the children swear they'd seen no one on their way to the lesson. They hadn't. But 11-year-old Connor McNeil mentioned that his older brother had been approached by a well-dressed man asking questions about schools and teachers in the area. Brennan's hands trembled as he taught that day, and not from the cold. 4 days later, on March 6th, Widow O'Hare's dog, a terrier named Finn who slept across Brennan's threshold, died during the night. The widow found him at dawn, stiff and cold, with foam crusted around his muzzle. "It's the poison," said her neighbor, examining the body. "See the foam? Same as when rats eat the arsenic the mill puts out." But Finn never chased rats. He was old, nearly blind, and spent his days sleeping by the fire. Why would he suddenly consume rat poison in the middle of the night? Brennan didn't believe in coincidence. A dog stationed at his door, dead of poison. The message was clear: "We know where you sleep. We can reach you anytime we want." He moved to a different lodging that very day, a room above a Catholic cobbler's shop on the outskirts of town. He told Widow O'Hare he'd return for his few belongings later. He never got the chance. On March 8th, Brennan failed to appear at the scheduled teaching location. 20 students and their parents waited for 3 hours in a cave near the Lagan River, convinced their master had finally been arrested. But Brennan hadn't been arrested. He was hiding. He later told his friend Father Donal Quinn that he'd spotted the same well-dressed stranger watching the cobbler's shop at dawn. When Brennan left through the back entrance and circled toward the teaching location, he saw the man again, this time on horseback, accompanied by 2 riders in the distinctive green coats of the local yeomanry militia. Brennan had fled into the hills, spending the day in a sheep shelter, emerging only after dark to make his way back to town. Father Quinn urged him to leave Dromore entirely, to seek safety in the Catholic strongholds of Western Ireland. "You can't teach if you're dead, Thomas," the priest said. But Brennan was stubborn. These were his students. This was his calling. If he ran, the Brit. Ish 1. Another Hedge school closed. Another community denied education in their own language. "I'll be more careful," Brennan promised. "I'll change locations more frequently. I'll vary my routes." Father Quinn shook his head. He would later testify that he knew in that moment that Thomas Brennan was a dead man. On March 12th, 2 days before Brennan's body was found, the cobbler brought Brennan a note that had been slipped under the shop door during the night. The paper was expensive, the handwriting educated. It contained only 6 words: "The wages of treason is death." Brennan showed the note to no one except Father Quinn, who begged him again to flee. But Brennan had already made his decision. He had scheduled one final lesson for March 13th, a group of older students preparing for potential university education abroad, if their families could ever afford passage. After that lesson, he promised the priest he would leave for Belfast and then take a ship to Scotland. The lesson was scheduled for late afternoon, at an abandoned corn mill 2 miles north of Dromore, accessible only by crossing a stone bridge over a narrow tributary of the Lagan River. Thomas Brennan left the cobbler's shop at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of March 13, 1817, carrying his leather satchel of books and slates. He was seen by 4 witnesses walking north on the Ballinderry Road, moving at his usual brisk pace. None of his students showed up to the corn mill that day. Later, each family would report receiving word, through different messengers, that the lesson had been cancelled. Thomas Brennan never taught another class. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Thomas Brennan's position. Would you have fled at the first sign of danger? Or stood your ground like he did? Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Now let's discover what 8-year-old Siobhan McCafferty and her donkey found at that bridge. The morning of March 14, 1817, dawned clear and bitterly cold. Young Siobhan McCafferty had been sent by her mother to bring a basket of eggs to her aunt in the next townland, a journey that required crossing the stone bridge over the Lagan tributary. Her donkey, Bartholomew, had made this crossing dozens of times without incident. But on this morning everything changed. Siobhan would later describe in testimony recorded by the local magistrate how Bartholomew had been queer and nervous-like from the moment they left the farmyard. The animal kept stopping, its ears swiveling as if listening for sounds she couldn't hear. When they reached the approach to the bridge, perhaps 50 yards from the structure itself, Bartholomew planted his feet and refused to move. "I pulled on his rope," she testified, "but he wouldn't budge. He started making this sound, not his normal bray, but something higher, like a scream. His eyes went white and he backed up so fast he near knocked me over." For 3 hours the child tried everything she knew to coax the donkey across. She offered it bread. She tried leading it from the far side. She even attempted to blindfold it with her shawl. Nothing worked. Bartholomew would not approach within 20 feet of the bridge. When Patrick McCafferty arrived, irritated that his daughter hadn't completed her errand, he brought a switch, fully prepared to beat sense into the stubborn animal. But when he saw Bartholomew, trembling, sweating despite the cold, that strange high whining coming from its throat, he felt the first cold finger of dread. "Animals know things," he would later say. "They sense evil that we can't. I knew something was wrong before I ever looked in that water, but look, he did." The stream was perhaps 15 feet wide at that point, running clear and shallow over a bed of smooth stones. The water was so transparent, you could count pebbles on the bottom, which is why Patrick McCafferty could see, with horrible clarity, what lay between two large rocks on the downstream side of the bridge. A man's body, dressed in dark clothes, lay face down in water barely 3 feet deep. One arm was extended toward the bank, the fingers curled as if grasping for purchase. The other arm was trapped beneath the body. The man's coat had ridden up, exposing the pale skin of his back. But it was the head that would haunt Patrick McCafferty's nightmares for the rest of his life. The skull was cracked open at the base, the injury visible even from the bridge above. The water around the head carried a faint pink tinge that the current couldn't quite disperse. And wedged in the rocks near the body was a blood-streaked stone the size of a man's fist, far too large to have arrived there naturally, far too conveniently placed. McCafferty ran for the constabulary. Within an hour, Constable William Morrison arrived with 2 assistants. They waded into the freezing water and dragged Thomas Brennan's body onto the bank. Morrison, a Protestant but a fair-minded man by the standards of the time, immediately noticed details that contradicted a simple drowning. His official report, preserved in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, reads, "The deceased, identified as Thomas Brennan, schoolmaster, was discovered in the stream at approximately 11 o'clock in the forenoon. The body showed signs of violence inconsistent with accidental death. The skull was fractured at the base, with a wound measuring approximately 3 inches across. Bruising on the upper arm suggested the deceased had been forcibly restrained. The depth of water, measured at 33 inches, would not cause drowning in a conscious, healthy man. Most significantly, the deceased's boots showed no mud or debris on the soles, suggesting he did not walk to this location but was carried or dragged." Morrison continued his examination. Brennan's pockets had been turned inside out. His leather satchel was missing, the one multiple witnesses had seen him carrying the previous afternoon. His fingers bore fresh abrasions consistent with defensive wounds. And then Morrison found the detail that transformed this from murder to execution. Around Brennan's neck, hidden beneath his shirt collar, was a thin rope burn, the kind made by someone being strangled from behind. The mark was deep enough to have drawn blood, but not deep enough to have killed him. This was a restraint injury, Morrison concluded. Someone had held Brennan with a garrote while someone else struck the killing blow to his head. This was a coordinated attack. This was planned. This was assassination. Dr. Henry Walsh, the nearest physician willing to examine a Catholic corpse, arrived that afternoon. His autopsy findings, recorded in meticulous detail, revealed the final horrifying truth. Thomas Brennan had been alive when he entered the water. The pattern of bleeding from the head wound, the water in the lungs, the specific discoloration of the skin, all indicated that Brennan had been struck on the head, strangled to the point of unconsciousness but not death, and then held face down in the shallow stream until he drowned. "This man was murdered with deliberation and cruelty," Dr. Walsh wrote. "The perpetrators ensured he would suffer before dying. The head wound alone might not have killed him immediately. The strangulation was insufficient to cause death. Only the drowning completed what was clearly intended as a prolonged execution." The final detail came from young Connor McNeil, one of Brennan's students. On the evening of March 13th, Connor had been fishing downstream when he heard voices near the bridge, angry voices speaking English with Protestant accents. He heard the word traitor shouted and the sound of a scuffle, then silence. The boy had been too frightened to investigate. He'd run home and told no one until after the body was discovered. "I should have helped him," Connor would repeat for the rest of his life. "I should have done thing." But what could a 12-year-old boy have done against armed men carrying out an execution? The investigation into Thomas Brennan's murder revealed the corruption that festered at the heart of British colonial administration in Ireland, and the terrible ease with which informants could arrange murder with impunity. Constable Morrison pursued the case with unusual determination for a Protestant investigating the death of a Catholic. He interviewed witnesses, tracked movements, and compiled a list of suspects that pointed directly at the network of informants employed by Magistrate Sir Edmund Ashford. The well-dressed stranger who had been following Brennan was identified as James Whitley, a professional informant who had previously testified against 3 other Hedge schoolmasters. Whitley was known to operate with the protection of local authorities, receiving payment for each Catholic teacher he exposed. Morrison's investigation revealed that Whitley had been tracking Brennan for nearly 6 weeks, compiling detailed reports on his movements, his lodgings, and his teaching locations. But Whitley had grown frustrated. Brennan was too careful, moved too frequently, never stayed in one place long enough for a proper raid and arrest. On March 12th, Whitley had met with Sir Edmund Ashford and 2 members of the local yeomanry, a Protestant militia force known for brutality against Catholics. According to a servant who overheard the conversation, Whitley complained that Brennan was impossible to catch legally, and suggested more direct methods. Ashford allegedly responded, "Do what must be done. The crown cannot be seen to act, but loyal subjects must do their duty." That permission, vague enough to provide deniability but clear enough to authorize murder, sealed Thomas Brennan's fate. On the afternoon of March 13th, Whitley and 2 yeomanry soldiers, later identified as Robert Crawford and Samuel Moore, positioned themselves near the bridge to the corn mill. They had sent false messages to Brennan's students, ensuring no witnesses would be present. When Brennan approached the bridge, they were waiting. The attack was swift and brutal. Crawford grabbed Brennan from behind, looping a rope around his neck to prevent him from crying out. Moore struck him on the back of the head with a large stone. Then, while Brennan was semi-conscious and choking on the rope, they dragged him down the bank and held his face in the water until he stopped struggling. They searched his body, taking his satchel, which contained student names and would have justified arrests. They arranged the scene to look like an accidental drowning. A man who slipped on ice, hit his head, and fell into the stream. Then they left, confident that the death of another Catholic troublemaker would be written off as misadventure. They hadn't counted on the donkey. Constable Morrison arrested James Whitley on March 20th. He arrested Robert Crawford and Samuel Moore on March 22nd. All 3 were charged with murder. The case seemed clear: witnesses, physical evidence, motive, opportunity. But then the machinery of colonial justice began to grind. Sir Edmund Ashford, magistrate and the man who had authorized the killing, recused himself from the case due to his personal acquaintance with the accused. The replacement magistrate, Sir Thomas Davenant, was Ashford's brother-in-law. The trial was moved to Belfast, where Protestant juries were guaranteed. The trial, held in June 1817, was a travesty of justice that shocked even hardened observers. The prosecution, led by a young Catholic barrister named Daniel O'Connell, who would later become one of Ireland's greatest political leaders, presented devastating evidence. He called 16 witnesses. He presented Dr. Walsh's autopsy findings. He demonstrated that Brennan's death was physically impossible as an accident. He traced the conspiracy from Ashford's office to the bridge where Brennan died. The defense presented a single argument: Thomas Brennan was a criminal engaged in illegal education, and therefore his death, while unfortunate, was the natural consequence of his treasonous activities. Furthermore, the defense argued, there was no proof that the accused men had actually killed Brennan, merely that they had been in the area. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. James Whitley was acquitted entirely. Robert Crawford and Samuel Moore were convicted of manslaughter, not murder, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Both were released after 11 months for good behavior. No one was ever charged with conspiracy. Sir Edmund Ashford faced no consequences for authorizing the killing. The yeomanry unit that employed Crawford and Moore continued operating without interruption. The message was clear: you could murder a Catholic teacher in broad daylight and face virtually no punishment, provided you had the right connections. But the story doesn't end there. The acquittal and light sentences sparked outrage throughout Catholic Ireland. Daniel O'Connell published a pamphlet detailing the case, titled "The Murder of Thomas Brennan, Justice Denied in British Ireland." The pamphlet circulated widely, selling over 10,000 copies and drawing international attention to the case. Protestant newspapers defended the verdict, arguing that Brennan had brought his fate upon himself through illegal activities. But privately, even some Protestant clergy expressed disgust at the obvious corruption of the trial. The Catholic community of Dromore erected an illegal memorial stone at the bridge where Brennan died. Authorities removed it 3 times. It was replaced each time under cover of darkness. The 4th iteration was carved directly into the bridge itself and proved impossible to remove without destroying the entire structure. It remains there to this day, weathered but legible. Thomas Brennan, teacher, murdered here, March 13, 1817. Even the beasts knew evil. The reference to Bartholomew the donkey became legendary throughout Ireland. The animal lived another 12 years and was never known to cross that bridge again, despite multiple attempts by different owners. Farmers claimed the donkey could sense the lingering stain of murder on the stones. Sir Edmund Ashford died in 1823 under circumstances his family refused to discuss. His death certificate listed sudden illness, but rumors persisted of suicide driven by guilt or fear. His estate fell into ruin. No one wanted to purchase property associated with such obvious corruption. James Whitley disappeared from public records after the trial. Some claimed he fled to America. Others whispered that he'd been found dead in a ditch outside Belfast in 1819, killed by persons unknown. No one investigated very thoroughly. Robert Crawford and Samuel Moore both died young, Crawford of drink in 1821, Moore in a farming accident in 1824. Neither man ever spoke publicly about the night they killed Thomas Brennan, but both were known to drink heavily and avoid any conversation about the case. The murder of Thomas Brennan, and the subsequent failure of justice, became a rallying point for the Catholic emancipation movement in Ireland. Daniel O'Connell, who had prosecuted the case, used it as a prime example of why Catholics needed political representation and legal equality. "They can murder our teachers, our priests, our community leaders," O'Connell wrote, "and the law offers no protection. This cannot stand. This will not stand." The case contributed to growing pressure for reform of the penal laws. While full Catholic emancipation wouldn't come until 1829, the Brennan case helped shift public opinion, even among some Protestants who were horrified by the obvious corruption and injustice of the trial. Hedge schools, rather than being suppressed by the murder, actually increased in number. The Catholic community saw Brennan's death as martyrdom and responded with defiance rather than fear. By 1820, there were an estimated 450 Hedge schools operating in Ulster alone, more than before Brennan's death. The case also exposed the informant system that made such murders possible. Public awareness of how informants operated and how they could orchestrate violence with impunity led to some reforms in how such individuals were employed and supervised, though the system itself continued until the 20th century. What's perhaps most significant is how the case reveals the intersection of education, religion, and violence in colonial contexts. The British Empire claimed to bring civilization and enlightenment to Ireland, yet it murdered those who tried to educate their own people. The hypocrisy was too obvious to ignore, and it undermined British moral authority in Ireland in ways that resonated for generations. The Brennan case also demonstrates how animals can serve as unexpected witnesses to human evil. The donkey's refusal to cross the bridge, initially dismissed as animal stubbornness, turned out to be a response to genuine danger. This has led to speculation about whether animals can sense the residue of violence, whether through smell, sound, or some sense we don't fully understand. Similar cases emerged in the years following Brennan's death. In 1822, another Hedge schoolmaster named Patrick O'Malley was found dead near Galway under suspicious circumstances. The investigation revealed a similar pattern: informant surveillance, violent attack, corrupt trial, minimal punishment. The parallels were so exact that historians believe O'Malley's murderers used the Brennan case as a blueprint. In 1825, a teacher named Bridget Cleary disappeared near Cork. Her body was never found, but witnesses reported seeing a group of men dragging something wrapped in canvas toward the river. No investigation was ever opened, despite detailed testimony from multiple witnesses. These cases created a climate of terror around Hedge schools, but they also created a climate of resistance. Teachers who continued to work despite the danger became heroes in their communities. Parents who sent their children to illegal schools were making a profound statement of defiance against colonial authority. The broader lesson of the Brennan case is about the nature of resistance and power. The British Empire had all the legal authority, all the military force, all the institutional power, but they couldn't stop people from teaching their children in ditches and fields, in their own language, preserving their own culture. Thomas Brennan died for teaching children to read. Let that sink in. In supposedly civilized, Christian, enlightened 19th century Europe, a man was murdered by agents of the state for the crime of literacy education. And yet the Hedge schools survived. The Irish language survived, though barely. The culture survived. The British Empire is gone, but Ireland remains, shaped by the courage of people like Thomas Brennan, who chose their students over their safety. The memorial stone at the bridge has become a pilgrimage site for teachers from around the world. Educators visiting Ireland often make the journey to Dromore to see the place where one of their profession died for his calling. They leave flowers, stones, and sometimes small chalkboards with messages of solidarity across time. The Irish National Teachers Organization awards an annual Thomas Brennan Medal to teachers who serve in difficult or dangerous circumstances. Recipients have included educators working in war zones, refugee camps, and areas of extreme poverty. The medal features an image of a donkey refusing to cross a bridge, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely witnesses reveal the deepest truths. Perhaps most powerfully, the case reminds us that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic gestures. It arrives wearing respectable clothes, carrying legal documents, speaking the language of order and loyalty. It justifies itself with reference to law and necessity. It hides behind the respectability of institutions and the comfort of the status quo. James Whitley wasn't a monster in appearance. He was a professional man doing his job, collecting his pay, serving what he believed was legitimate authority. Sir Edmund Ashford was a magistrate, a pillar of the community, a man who attended church and hosted dinner parties. Robert Crawford and Samuel Moore were soldiers, following orders, protecting what they'd been taught was civilization against barbarism. But they drowned a man in 3 feet of water for teaching children to read. That's the horror at the heart of the Brennan case. Not that inhuman monsters committed atrocities, but that ordinary people did, while convincing themselves it was necessary, justified, even righteous. What do you think drove James Whitley, Robert Crawford, and Samuel Moore to such acts? Were they true believers in the colonial mission, convinced they were protecting civilization? Were they simply following orders, the eternal excuse of those who commit evil on behalf of authority? Or were they motivated by something darker? The thrill of power over the powerless, the satisfaction of violence sanctioned by the state. Leave your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you think about a system that could murder a teacher and call it justice. And if you know of similar cases from history, times when education itself was treated as a crime, share those stories too. Subscribe to Fear Abbey for more lost chapters of history where the horror isn't supernatural, but all too human. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an investigation into the darkness that lurks in our past. The next time you see a memorial, a bridge, a simple stone marker on the side of the road, stop and read it. Someone's story is written there. Someone's truth is waiting to be heard. Even the beasts knew evil. Will we? See you in the next video.